Okay, we're looking at chapter 7 in our text, Mark, an apology for the crucifixion of Jesus. Dr. Gundry goes almost verse by verse through the Gospel of Mark, and it's very good. His focus is on how Mark is an explanation or an apology for why such a terrible thing as crucifixion should happen to the Son of God. Mark was written by John Mark in Rome. Papias, an early church father, tells us that really John Mark was with Peter there in prison, and that is the way the gospel was written. In other words, the Gospel of Mark might well have been the Gospel of Peter as well as being called Mark. But let's look at Mark from a little bit of a different perspective. I'd like to back up just a little bit, give some background. Who is this person, John Mark, in the first place? When we read through not only the Gospels, but the book of Acts, John Mark turns out to be a very significant and central individual all the way through the New Testament. Acts 12:12 says this, "So when he, Peter, considered this," now Peter had just been released from prison by angelic visitation, and when he walked out of the prison, when he considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. There's this upper room where there's a prayer meeting taking place. Acts chapter 12, they're praying for Peter to be released from prison. The room is owned by a lady by the name of Mary, and her son is named John Mark. This is the John Mark that we're talking about, who helped in the writing of the gospel, who was with Peter in Rome. This upper room, incidentally, turns out to be a very significant place in the last parts of the gospel and the early part of the book of Acts. It is the room in which the Last Supper took place. It is the room in which Jesus visited with his disciples in John chapter 20, just after his resurrection. It is the room in which the outpouring of the Holy Spirit took place in Acts chapter 2. It is also the place where in Acts chapter 4 there was a prayer meeting taking place and the entire room was shaken. In other words, John Mark and his family were at the core of what took place in the early church and in the last days of Jesus. John Mark himself was never one of the apostles. He was never one of the disciples of Jesus, as in the 12 disciples, but he was right there with them all the way through. In fact, most Bible scholars agree that on the night that Jesus was betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas came and kissed Jesus on the cheek, the Roman centurions took Jesus, that John Mark was also there. Mark 14:51, the young man mentioned in this verse, most Bible scholars agree it was John Mark. A certain young man was following him, having a linen cloth thrown over his naked body, and the men laid hold on him, and he fled that night. John Mark was there at the betrayal of Jesus. As we go further into the whole picture of who this young man John Mark was, we find that he plays a major part in the book of Acts. Whenever Paul and Barnabas came back from their first missionary journey, they brought money back to Jerusalem. It appears that they linked up with John Mark then, and he took off with them on their second missionary journey. They made it to Cyprus, but somewhere in there, when they stepped into Asia Minor, John Mark decided he'd had enough, and he wanted to go back home, and so he returned. He departed back to Jerusalem. Now, whenever Paul and Barnabas returned then from that second missionary journey and are about to set out on their third journey, Barnabas, who incidentally, according to Colossians chapter 4, is the cousin of John Mark. Barnabas wants to bring his cousin along. Paul will have nothing of that. He's obviously burned from the fact that John Mark left them the first time, and he said he's not going to have it. the division was so intense that they parted ways, Paul and Barnabas, and we do not hear in the book of Acts any further about Barnabas or John Mark. Paul takes Silas as his new travel companion, and off he goes on his next missionary journey. John Mark. We don't really hear about John Mark again until the letters, when we find that in Rome, Paul in 2 Timothy has somehow come to a new appreciation of John Mark, and he says, send John Mark, bring John Mark with you, and bring the parchments. Bring John Mark because he is, quote, useful in the ministry. We read about John Mark in Philemon, verse 24, that he has in fact arrived in Rome with Paul, and of course Peter's there also. One last thing about John Mark, and we'll be through. Tradition. What happened to John Mark after the book of Acts? Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, says that Mark became the first patriarch of the church in Alexandria, Egypt. He was the founder, in fact, according to Eusebius, of Christianity in Africa. Tradition says that John Mark led the people of Egypt in turning away from the worship of Egyptian gods. In so doing, he incurred the wrath of the pagan leaders and was martyred, burned to death in 67 A.D. John Mark. We honor this young man. He had his faults, he had his flaws, he had his mistakes, but he was a great man. He was one of the leaders. We have his gospel, and as we read it, we thank God and we learn more about Jesus Christ.